Death once crept silently through the cobbled streets of medieval Europe, unseen and unstoppable. Entire towns fell quiet, church bells tolled without rest, and fear clouded every corner of daily life. The world, as it was known, trembled beneath the shadow of an invisible enemy, the Black Death. More than just a disease, it was a force that rewrote history, changed the fate of nations, and reshaped how humanity viewed life, death, and survival. Even centuries later, its dark legacy still lingers in ways we continue to uncover. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will journey deep into the enduring impact of the Black Death, how it transformed Europe's culture, reshaped its society, and why this centuries-old plague still matters in our modern world. Stay with us as we unravel the haunting shadow of one of history's deadliest pandemics and explore the powerful lessons it still holds for us today. The story of one of history's most feared pandemics begins far from the crowded towns and bustling cities of medieval Europe. In the heartlands of Central Asia, where the vast steppes stretch endlessly and nomadic tribes have traversed ancient paths for centuries, a silent and deadly force began to emerge. This force, unknown to those it first touched, would travel thousands of miles, silently weaving its way through networks of trade and human contact. It began unnoticed, like a whisper on the wind, carried by merchants, travelers, and animals, until it reached the thriving trade hubs and populous settlements of Asia and beyond. The precise origin of the disease remains a subject of scholarly debate, but most historians and scientists agree that it likely emerged in the remote mountainous regions of Central Asia. Here, wild rodents, particularly marmots, are believed to have harbored the deadly bacterium. These animals, living in proximity to human communities and domestic animals, became the first unwitting hosts of a pathogen that would forever alter the course of human history. This bacterium, later identified as Yersinia pestis, found its way from the wilderness into human civilization, where it would encounter the perfect storm of conditions to explode into a pandemic. Trade routes, particularly the famed Silk Road, acted as conduits for more than just silk, spices, and precious stones. They were lifelines that connected distant parts of the world, allowing goods, ideas, cultures, and unfortunately, diseases to move with remarkable efficiency. From the furthest reaches of Asia, traders brought with them infected fleas, hidden in bundles of cloth or clinging to the fur of animals. These fleas, in turn, infected local rat populations that flourished in towns and cities due to poor sanitation and the abundance of waste. It was through this chain, wild rodent to flea, flea to rat, rat to human, that the plague began to take hold. The bustling trading ports and caravansaries of Central Asia and the Middle East served as the next stage of the bacterium's journey. As the disease crept westward, carried by both land caravans and maritime vessels, it infiltrated cities such as Samarkand and Baghdad. The world at that time was transforming in terms of trade and mobility, which unwittingly provided the plague with endless opportunities to spread. Ships leaving the Black Sea, for example, brought the plague to the Mediterranean world. It is believed that Genoese traders fleeing an outbreak in the Crimean city of Kaffa brought the infection with them to Europe in the mid-14th century. By the year 1446, the plague had made its way to Europe's doorstep. It arrived not as an army but as a shadow, slipping silently into port cities such as Constantinople, Messina, and Venice. From there, it moved with shocking speed and devastating effect. The first signs of its presence were not always recognized for what they were. Illness, after all, was a part of life in the medieval world. But this was something different, more virulent, more terrifying, and seemingly unstoppable. Once the plague took root in Europe, it spread like wildfire. The social, economic, and environmental conditions of the time created the ideal environment for such a disease to thrive. Towns and cities were overcrowded. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, and knowledge of disease transmission was virtually non-existent. Rats and fleas were ubiquitous, living among the refuse in the narrow, filthy alleyways of medieval settlements. People lived in close quarters, and personal hygiene was generally poor, which meant that the bacteria had little resistance in its path. As the disease advanced from town to town, its symptoms became all too familiar. Victims would first experience fever, chills, and weakness. Then came the unmistakable swelling of the lymph nodes, which could become as large as eggs and turn black due to internal bleeding. These were the buboes, from which the disease gained one of its names, the bubonic plague. In some cases, the infection would spread to the lungs, leading to pneumonic plague. a form even more contagious and deadly. Others developed septicemic plague, in which the bacteria spread through the bloodstream, often killing within hours. Death could come swiftly, and often did. Families were torn apart, communities decimated, and entire villages abandoned. The speed and brutality of the disease bred terror. Traditional methods of burying the dead quickly became overwhelmed, and mass graves were dug to accommodate the growing number of corpses. In some cities, the death toll reached staggering levels. Paris, Florence, and London all suffered immensely, losing significant portions of their populations within just a few months. As the pandemic unfolded, people struggled to understand what was happening. In an era where science was still in its infancy and medicine was based more on ancient texts than empirical evidence, explanations varied widely. Many believed that the plague was a punishment from God, a divine retribution for the sins of humanity. This belief led to the rise of religious fervor and practices such as self-flagellation, in which people would publicly whip themselves in an attempt to atone for collective sins. Others sought scapegoats, and tragically, Jewish communities across Europe were often blamed for poisoning wells or bringing the disease through dark magic. This led to horrific acts of violence and persecution. There were also more grounded attempts to identify the causes and cures of the disease. Some physicians, drawing upon the works of classical authors like Galen and Hippocrates, theorized that the plague was caused by miasma, or bad air. They believed that foul smells emanating from decaying matter or celestial alignments were to blame. As a result, people carried sweet-smelling herbs or wore beaked masks filled with aromatic substances, hoping to ward off the invisible menace. While ineffective, these practices at least demonstrated a desire to find some rational basis for the catastrophe. Other strategies were more practical, though not always successful. Infected individuals and families were often isolated or confined, though the understanding of contagion was rudimentary. Quarantines were introduced in some cities, and ships arriving in port were sometimes held for a period before passengers were allowed to disembark. These early efforts at containment represented the beginnings of public health measures, even if they were not always implemented consistently or effectively. Despite these efforts, the plague continued to rage across Europe for several years. It did not discriminate by class or status. Kings and queens, peasants and merchants, priests and children, none were spared. The social fabric of Europe began to fray under the immense strain. Labor shortages became widespread as workers died in droves, leading to economic disruption and changes in the feudal system. The scarcity of labor gave surviving workers more bargaining power, and wages began to rise. Landowners were forced to adapt to new economic realities, and traditional hierarchies were challenged. Religious institutions also suffered profound losses. Many clergy members died while tending to the sick, and faith in the church was shaken as prayers and rituals failed to stop the plague. Some people turned inward, seeking personal spirituality, while others embraced hedonism, believing the world was ending. Art and literature from the period began to reflect the pervasive sense of doom and despair. Images of dancing skeletons, grim reapers, and the transience of life became common motifs, encapsulating the mood of a continent in mourning. As waves of the plague came and went, Europe began to adapt. Over time, people learned to recognize the signs of an outbreak and take preventative action, though their understanding of disease transmission remained limited. The concept of quarantine began to take root more firmly, and some cities developed systems for monitoring public health. Medical texts began to be updated with observations and records from plague doctors, though much of the information was still steeped in outdated theories. The impact of the Black Death was not solely negative, though its cost in human life was staggering. In the long term, it accelerated social, economic, and intellectual changes that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. The rigid structures of medieval society began to give way to a more dynamic and flexible order. With fewer people and more land available, survivors had opportunities to improve their status and wealth. The decline of serfdom in some regions and the rise of urban centers can be partially attributed to the demographic shifts caused by the plague. Culturally, the experience of the Black Death left a deep and lasting imprint. It forced people to confront the fragility of life and the limitations of human understanding. This, in turn, laid the groundwork for the questioning spirit that would later define the Enlightenment. The search for meaning, order, and rationality in the face of inexplicable suffering became a driving force in European thought for generations to come. Even as the immediate threat of the Black Death receded, its echoes could still be felt. The disease did not disappear entirely. Instead, it became endemic in some regions and returned periodically in lesser, but still deadly outbreaks. These recurrences served as grim reminders of the initial catastrophe and ensured that the lessons of the past were not easily forgotten. Looking back, the rise and spread of the Black Death reveal much about the vulnerabilities of human societies and the interconnectedness of our world. It was not merely a natural disaster, but a complex event shaped by geography, trade, ignorance, fear, and resilience. Its story is a reminder that even the most advanced civilizations are not immune to the forces of nature, and that understanding, compassion, and adaptability are essential in the face of crisis. Though centuries have passed since the plague first cast its shadow across Europe, its legacy remains. Modern science has unraveled the mysteries of the pathogen that caused it, and public health systems have developed to prevent such widespread devastation. Yet the memory of that dark period lingers in the collective consciousness, a testament to the suffering endured and the strength shown by those who lived through one of history's most profound tragedies. It serves as a warning, a lesson, and a story of survival against the odds. In the heart of the 14th century, a catastrophe unfolded that would forever change the course of human history. As the Black Death swept across continents, it did far more than take lives. It unraveled the very fabric of medieval society. The world, already shaped by hierarchy and tradition, was plunged into chaos. The rhythms of everyday life were disrupted, social norms were turned upside down, and the psychological and spiritual anchors of communities began to fray. What emerged from this calamity was not simply a society mourning its dead, but a world that had been fundamentally altered in nearly every aspect of its being. Life in medieval Europe prior to the plague had been marked by a rigid structure. People were bound by class and occupation, most living under feudal obligations where peasants toiled on land owned by nobles, and the church offered spiritual guidance and authority. Order was both a societal and religious ideal. But when the plague arrived, that order crumbled with astonishing speed. Entire families vanished, villages emptied overnight, and institutions that had seemed eternal suddenly appeared vulnerable. The plague did not discriminate. Lords and laborers, clergy and laity, merchants and beggars all found themselves equally exposed. The sheer scope of death defied understanding. As people perished in vast numbers, communities were left without workers, without leaders, and often without hope. In cities, the once familiar buzz of daily life gave way to an eerie silence, broken only by the tolling of bells and the cries of the grieving. Markets closed, fields went untilled, and the streets became the domain of the dying and the dead. The death toll was staggering. In some regions, entire populations were halved in a matter of months. Families were torn apart so completely that no one remained to bury the dead. The overwhelming number of corpses led to mass graves, hastily dug and filled to capacity, sometimes with the assistance of prisoners or the few brave enough to undertake the task. Funeral rites were often abandoned, not from a lack of faith, but from the simple impossibility of performing them for everyone. Grief was left unexpressed, not by choice, but because the scale of loss was too great to accommodate mourning in its traditional forms. As death swept through towns and countryside alike, social structures began to shift. With so many peasants and laborers gone, the survivors found themselves in unexpected demand. Landowners, desperate to harvest their crops and maintain their estates, had no choice but to offer better wages and conditions. Those who once had little power suddenly held leverage, and they began to assert it. In some cases, serfs abandoned their lords altogether, seeking better opportunities in other regions. This movement and mobility would have been unthinkable before the plague, but necessity gave rise to new possibilities. This shift created tension across all levels of society. Nobles and landowners attempted to impose wage controls and restrict mobility, fearing the erosion of their authority. Governments issued laws trying to force people back into their former roles and limit the rising cost of labor. These measures often failed, leading to unrest and, in some cases, open rebellion. The old order could not be fully restored, and while the elite sought to reassert dominance, the foundation of feudalism had been deeply shaken. Economic life was similarly transformed. With fewer people to feed, demand for food decreased, leading to a drop in prices. Yet the scarcity of workers led to increased wages and shifting patterns of wealth. Some who had previously lived in poverty found themselves in possession of land or property left behind by deceased relatives. Small merchants and artisans were able to charge more for their goods and services. A new sense of social fluidity began to emerge, challenging the rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval Europe for centuries. However, not all economic consequences were positive. Trade suffered, especially in areas hit hardest by the plague. Ports closed, caravans ceased their journeys, and merchant guilds found themselves decimated. Cities that had once thrived on commerce became ghost towns. Inflation followed in some areas, and the interruption of supply chains caused shortages of vital goods. In rural areas, fields lay fallow and livestock roamed unattended. The agricultural economy, which formed the backbone of medieval society, was deeply damaged. The effects on daily life were profound and often surreal. Survivors found themselves navigating a world where nothing felt secure. Familiar faces were missing, routines were disrupted, and the once bustling rhythms of town and village life had slowed to a crawl. In some places, social customs disappeared altogether. People fled from one another, terrified of contagion. Neighbors avoided neighbors, friends abandoned friends, and even family members sometimes refused to care for the sick. The bonds that tied people together weakened under the weight of fear and desperation. Fear was a constant companion. The invisible nature of the disease and its seemingly random strikes fueled a sense of helplessness. People did not understand how the plague spread, and so they filled the void of knowledge with theories and superstitions. Many believed the plague was a divine punishment, a sign of God's wrath for human sinfulness. This belief led to an upsurge in religious extremism. Processions of flagellants wandered from town to town, beating themselves in public displays of penance, hoping that suffering might appease a furious deity. Others looked for earthly scapegoats. Jewish communities, already marginalized and often living under suspicion, became the targets of violent pogroms. Accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with dark forces to spread the disease, they were persecuted, exiled, and massacred in many parts of Europe. These attacks were not just the product of long-standing prejudice, but of a society grasping for someone to blame amidst overwhelming chaos. Religious institutions themselves were deeply affected. The clergy, called upon to provide spiritual support and last rites, died in large numbers. Monasteries were emptied, and parishes left without priests. The church, once a pillar of stability, struggled to maintain its authority. When prayers, processions, and pilgrimages failed to halt the spread of the disease, many began to question the church's power and teachings. A sense of disillusionment grew among the populace, weakening the trust that had long supported religious authority. At the same time, some turned more fervently to their faith, believing that divine mercy was their only hope. New religious movements began to arise, some seeking reform, others embracing apocalyptic visions. The line between faith and fear blurred, and the spiritual landscape became as unsettled as the physical world. Artists and writers of the period began to reflect this turmoil, depicting death as an ever-present figure and life as fleeting and uncertain. The motif of the danse macabre, or dance of death, became common in visual art, symbolizing the idea that death unites all, regardless of status or virtue. Psychologically, the impact of the plague was immense. People lived with the constant presence of death, often without time to grieve or process their losses. Anxiety, despair, and numbness became widespread. Survivors experienced a form of collective trauma, though the term did not exist at the time. Their world had been upended, and many emerged from the experience changed in profound ways. For some, this change led to cynicism and detachment. For others, it spurred a desire to seize life more fully, embracing pleasure and indulgence while they could. The idea that life was short and unpredictable took root in the cultural consciousness. This awareness manifested in various ways, from religious reform and philosophical reflection to the pursuit of beauty and knowledge that would characterize the coming Renaissance. The questioning of long-held beliefs, whether religious, social, or scientific, began in the shadow of the plague. Though the devastation was immense, it also served as a catalyst for intellectual and cultural shifts that would shape the future of Europe. Communities attempted to rebuild, but the path to recovery was slow and uncertain. The demographic collapse altered family structures, labor systems, and settlement patterns. Orphaned children became wards of the state or church. Women found themselves inheriting property and running households, and elderly survivors often found their final years marked by isolation. The absence of a generation left gaps that would take decades to fill. Though the plague eventually subsided, it never fully disappeared. In the years and centuries that followed, new outbreaks would occur, though none as devastating as the original pandemic. Each recurrence brought renewed fear, but also greater awareness and more structured responses. Public health measures such as quarantine, sanitation, and surveillance began to take root, slowly forming the foundation of modern epidemiology. The memory of the Black Death lingered. It found expression in literature, folklore, and tradition. Ghost stories, superstitions, and rituals evolved from the trauma of those years. The collective memory of the plague became part of Europe's identity, a dark chapter that colored how people viewed mortality, fate, and the limits of human power. Even centuries later, the plague stands as a defining moment in human history. It exposed the fragility of civilization and forced societies to confront their deepest fears. It revealed both the worst and best in people, acts of cruelty and scapegoating, as well as bravery, compassion, and resilience. It disrupted every aspect of life and demanded adaptation, reflection, and change. The transformation of the world in the wake of the plague was not instantaneous, nor was it uniformly positive, but it was real and lasting. It signaled the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, where certainty was elusive, but possibility was reborn from the ashes of destruction. The chaos that the Black Death unleashed was terrifying and tragic, but it also opened the door to a reimagining of what society could be and what individuals might become. In its wake, the world did not return to what it had been, because it could not. A new world was beginning to emerge, shaped by the memory of death, but also by the renewed appreciation for life. The Great Plague that swept through Europe in the middle of the 14th century did more than decimate populations. It reshaped the very foundations of the medieval world. The Black Death was not merely a biological disaster. It was a catalyst that disrupted centuries of social norms, economic practices, and political arrangements. The structures that had governed medieval life, some rigidly in place for generations, could not withstand the force of the pandemic's impact. When the death toll finally waned, the survivors found themselves in a world both familiar and unrecognizable, a place where old rules no longer applied and new ones had yet to be written. Before the plague struck, the medieval world was structured around a deeply entrenched hierarchy. Kings ruled at the top, nobles governed lands, and peasants worked the soil in exchange for protection and the right to exist within a feudal framework. The church was both a spiritual authority and a powerful landowner, and daily life revolved around religious festivals, agricultural cycles, and the unwritten but well-understood codes of duty, honor, and obedience. This world had developed slowly over centuries, shaped by custom and necessity, resistant to change and bound together by obligation rather than opportunity. When the plague arrived, this delicately balanced system was shattered. Death came with a swiftness and ferocity that rendered social distinctions irrelevant. Rich and poor alike succumbed. Priests and lords, bakers and shepherds, children and elders, no one was immune. Entire villages vanished. In cities, the dead piled up in homes and on streets. Survivors, desperate and terrified, abandoned not only their responsibilities but often their morals and loved ones, fleeing in hopes of saving themselves. The immediate consequence was the breakdown of established systems. With so many people dead, the labor force that sustained feudal agriculture collapsed. Landowners, once secure in their power and privilege, found themselves unable to find workers to harvest their crops or tend their animals. This scarcity of labor created a dramatic shift in economic power. Surviving peasants and workers, long accustomed to toil with little reward, now discovered they could demand better wages and improved conditions. In many places, they did exactly that, negotiating new arrangements or moving to different regions where they could bargain from a position of strength. This labor crisis led to a widespread transformation in the relationship between the classes. Landowners, desperate to maintain their holdings and lifestyles, offered more generous terms to keep workers. In some regions, serfdom began to erode, as peasants left the lands of their lords in search of higher-paying opportunities. Laws were passed in various countries to try to curb the rising expectations of laborers, fixing wages at pre-plague levels or forbidding people from leaving their villages. Yet enforcement of such rules proved difficult, and over time, many of these restrictions were ignored or abandoned. The land itself changed hands in new and unexpected ways. So many landowners had died without heirs that large tracts became available for purchase or reassignment. Wealth that had once been tied up in estates and inherited titles now began to move into different sectors of society. Merchants, artisans, and even successful peasants were able to acquire property, creating a more diverse and competitive landowning class. This redistribution of wealth and opportunity marked the beginning of a slow but significant move away from the rigid feudal system toward a more dynamic and market-driven society. Urban centers, though devastated by the plague, began to recover in ways that accelerated this transformation. Cities attracted displaced populations seeking new opportunities. Guilds, which regulated trades and maintained standards, adapted to the new economic climate. With fewer artisans and craftsmen, those who survived could command higher prices for their goods and services. Markets, once localized and restricted, began to expand. Trade routes that had temporarily collapsed during the height of the plague were reopened and even extended, as Europe looked outward for new sources of goods, wealth, and alliances. Politically, the consequences of the plague rippled through governments and monarchies. With traditional structures weakened, rulers were forced to reconsider how they governed. Some centralized power to better manage the crisis and its aftermath, creating the foundation for more modern forms of statehood. Others faced revolts, as rising social tensions exploded into violence. Peasant uprisings, such as those in England and France, were often fueled by resentment at attempts to reimpose the old order. While these rebellions were usually suppressed, they sent a clear message that the balance of power had shifted. Religious institutions, once unassailable, also experienced profound changes. The Church had suffered heavy losses, both in human life and in credibility. So many clergy had died ministering to the sick that entire dioceses were left leaderless. In their absence, replacements were often hastily chosen and sometimes lacked the same level of training or moral authority. The plague's failure to discriminate, coupled with the Church's inability to protect its flock, led to growing doubts about religious explanations and divine justice. This spiritual disappointment did not lead to a widespread rejection of faith, but it did lay the groundwork for reform. People began to seek more personal and individualized forms of devotion. Mysticism flourished, and lay religious movements gained traction. The gap between official doctrine and personal belief widened. Over time, these undercurrents of skepticism and spiritual yearning would contribute to larger movements for reform, culminating in events such as the Protestant Reformation. Cultural expressions of the period reveal just how deeply the plague had scarred the medieval imagination. Art became obsessed with themes of death, decay, and the impermanence of life. Skeletons danced with the living in murals and frescoes, reminding viewers of the thin line between existence and oblivion. Images of the Last Judgment and the torments of hell became more prominent, reflecting both fear of divine wrath and a renewed focus on the soul's fate after death. Literature, too, bore the imprint of the Black Death. Writers sought to capture the horror, the confusion, and the absurdity of a world turned upside down. In some cases, humor and satire were used to cope with the trauma. In others, solemnity and reflection took center stage. A few chroniclers, like Giovanni Boccaccio, bore witness in vivid prose, blending personal observation with storytelling to create a record that was both historical and human. The experience of the plague also reshaped how people thought about their place in the world. Prior to the disaster, life was often viewed as part of a divine order, with little room for questioning or change. After the plague, this view began to shift. The unpredictability of death and the failures of traditional authority encouraged a more questioning mindset. Over time, this questioning would contribute to new intellectual currents, including humanism and the revival of classical learning. In this sense, the Black Death helped to usher in the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the early modern era. It forced societies to confront hard truths about mortality, governance, and inequality. It disrupted patterns of inheritance and power that had endured for generations. And it opened space for new ideas, new leaders, and new ways of organizing life. In the devastation left behind, there was opportunity, not just for individuals, but for entire cultures to reinvent themselves. The legacy of the Black Death cannot be measured simply in terms of death or destruction. Its most enduring impact was the transformation it wrought. The plague exposed weaknesses in existing systems and accelerated the decline of outdated structures. It offered those who survived a grim freedom, the chance to reshape their lives in the absence of those who once controlled them. Though the price was unimaginably high, the result was a society that was in many ways more fluid, more open to change, and more aware of the fragility of the human condition. Even centuries later, echoes of the Black Death can be felt. It lives on in the way we think about disease, community, and mortality. It reminds us that disaster, while often indiscriminate in its damage, can also be a powerful force for change. The cultural memory of the plague, passed down through art, literature, and collective consciousness, continues to inform how societies respond to crisis. The scenes of death and despair may fade with time, but the lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the will to survive endure. The plague also changed how people viewed time. Prior to the Black Death, the medieval calendar was a predictable cycle of religious observances and agricultural duties. After the plague, the experience of time became more fractured. Survivors were not just rebuilding lives. They were navigating a new reality where the future was uncertain and the past felt lost. This sense of temporal dislocation contributed to shifts in historical thinking and the development of new ways to record, interpret, and understand human experience. In families, the plague altered the dynamics of inheritance and lineage. With so many heirs lost, wealth was consolidated into fewer hands, sometimes allowing women to play more active roles in managing estates. In other cases, new families rose to prominence, replacing older noble lines that had been extinguished. This changing of the guard brought new ideas and ambitions to the forefront, further unsettling the old order and encouraging innovation. Educational institutions, too, were impacted. Universities lost students and professors in vast numbers, and some closed temporarily. But the need for educated individuals in administration, medicine, and religion eventually led to a renewed emphasis on learning. Curricula began to shift, incorporating more secular and practical subjects alongside traditional theological studies. This evolution of education contributed to the intellectual ferment that would later fuel the Renaissance. In cities, architecture reflected the changes wrought by the plague. Some buildings were never completed, abandoned as priorities shifted. Others were redesigned with more attention to ventilation and cleanliness, reflecting a growing awareness of public health. Hospitals and quarantine facilities became more common, and though the understanding of disease remained rudimentary, efforts to control its spread became more organized. The plague also contributed to the decline of some communities and the rise of others. Certain towns never recovered, their populations too decimated to rebuild. Others capitalized on the redistribution of trade and wealth to grow in influence. Port cities, in particular, saw new opportunities as commerce revived and expanded. These shifting patterns of settlement and economic activity played a role in the gradual emergence of more urban, commercially driven societies. Throughout Europe, the sense that the world had changed forever was inescapable. Survivors carried with them not only the memory of those lost, but the knowledge that life could be upended at any moment. This awareness shaped decisions both large and small, from personal relationships to national policies. In the arts, it led to a deepening of emotional expression and a focus on the realities of human suffering. In governance, it encouraged experimentation and reform. In the economy, it fostered resilience and diversification. What remains of the Black Death today is more than historical record. It is a mirror reflecting how humans respond to crisis and how societies rebuild in its aftermath. The plague taught a harsh lesson, that even the most deeply rooted traditions can crumble, and even the most confident powers can fall. But it also demonstrated the capacity for renewal, for forging new paths when old ones have been blocked by tragedy. In every shadow it cast, there was also the possibility of light, a reminder that life, however fragile, continues. The Black Death, one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, left behind more than just a trail of death and despair. It provided a profound lesson on the nature of disease, the fragility of societal structures, and the enduring human capacity for adaptation and survival. Though centuries have passed since the plague swept through Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, its relevance remains sharply felt, particularly in light of modern pandemics. In an age of global travel, interconnected economies, and advanced science, the echoes of the 14th century still inform how humanity perceives and responds to widespread health crises. The lessons drawn from this distant catastrophe have shaped not only the systems designed to protect populations, but also the way societies think about illness, mortality, and collective responsibility. When the Black Death emerged, the world was unprepared. Societies lacked the scientific knowledge required to understand the mechanisms of transmission. Theories ranged from divine punishment to the influence of bad air or planetary alignments. In the absence of germ theory or a structured public health system, communities responded with fear, superstition, and often misguided practices. Quarantines were improvised, cities closed their gates, and people fled urban centers for the countryside, hoping that isolation would offer protection. Physicians, constrained by limited medical knowledge, resorted to traditional remedies and rituals, many of which proved ineffective. Despite the enormous toll in lives, this experience served as a crucible of learning, one that would slowly but inexorably lead to a more systematic understanding of disease. In the context of modern pandemics, these early responses offer a valuable point of comparison. The COVID-19 pandemic, among others, revealed both the progress humanity has made and the vulnerabilities that still exist. Unlike in the 14th century, scientists today understand pathogens, vectors of transmission, and the importance of public health measures. Yet, despite the availability of this knowledge, the response to contemporary outbreaks has often been uneven, shaped as much by politics, misinformation, and public behavior as by science. The gap between understanding and implementation continues to pose a challenge, much as it did during the plague years, when the absence of reliable information led to panic, scapegoating, and social division. One of the most striking similarities between the Black Death and modern pandemics lies in the way fear spreads alongside disease. In both eras, uncertainty has fueled anxiety and prompted extreme responses. During the plague, entire communities were blamed for the outbreak, leading to violence and persecution. In more recent times, fear has manifested in the form of conspiracy theories, social stigmatization, and resistance to health measures. These reactions, while different in form, are rooted in a common human impulse to make sense of chaos by seeking culprits or explanations, even when they are misguided. The importance of accurate information, therefore, cannot be overstated. One of the lasting lessons of the Black Death is that misinformation and superstition can be as dangerous as the disease itself. In the centuries following the plague, the growth of empirical science and the eventual acceptance of germ theory marked a turning point. Diseases were no longer seen solely as divine retribution, but as biological phenomena that could be studied, understood, and managed. This shift laid the foundation for modern medicine, epidemiology, and the global health systems that exist today. It also emphasized the critical role of communication between scientists, governments, and the public in ensuring effective responses to health threats. The value of public health measures was born out of necessity during the plague years. Cities began to experiment with quarantines, isolation zones, and the monitoring of incoming travelers and goods. Though rudimentary, these actions marked the beginning of organized efforts to control the spread of disease. In modern times, these principles have evolved into comprehensive strategies involving contact tracing, vaccination programs, sanitation, and international cooperation. Yet the basic idea remains the same: that collective action, guided by knowledge and supported by infrastructure, is essential to protecting populations. Despite advancements in medicine and technology, the challenges faced during the Black Death still resonate. Healthcare systems, especially in times of crisis, are often overwhelmed. Access to care remains unequal, particularly in marginalized or impoverished communities. Global cooperation, while improved, is still hindered by political interests and economic disparities. The experience of the plague underscores the importance of preparedness, investment in healthcare infrastructure, and the need for resilient systems capable of withstanding shocks. It also reminds us that disease does not respect borders, wealth, or status, and that responses must be inclusive and global in scope. The psychological and emotional impact of the plague offers another area of lasting relevance. In the 14th century, the constant presence of death altered how people viewed life. Art, literature, and religious practices became saturated with themes of mortality, suffering, and the search for meaning. This confrontation with the limits of human control led to both despair and creativity, giving rise to new artistic expressions and philosophical reflections. Modern pandemics have similarly forced individuals and societies to reevaluate priorities, question assumptions, and grapple with uncertainty. The collective trauma of living through widespread illness and loss creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. Resilience, then, emerges as a key theme linking past and present. Despite the scale of the catastrophe, humanity endured. Communities rebuilt, institutions adapted, and new ways of living emerged. The end of the plague did not mean a return to the old world. It marked the beginning of transformation. Social structures shifted, economies were reconfigured, and cultural expressions evolved. The same can be said for more recent health crises, which have catalyzed innovation in healthcare delivery, accelerated the use of digital tools, and spurred renewed focus on global health. Perhaps one of the most enduring contributions of the Black Death is its role in shaping our collective understanding of disease. It highlighted the interconnectedness of human societies and the consequences of ecological and demographic pressures. It exposed the limitations of relying solely on tradition and authority in times of crisis. And it illustrated the power of adaptability, how the willingness to learn, change, and act collectively can turn the tide even in the darkest moments. These insights have become embedded in public health policy, disaster planning, and educational curricula, forming the backbone of how modern societies prepare for and respond to threats. The story of the plague also serves as a cautionary tale. It warns against complacency, against assuming that modern technology alone can shield us from catastrophe. It reminds us that vigilance, cooperation, and compassion are not luxuries but necessities. While the tools available today far surpass those of the past, the human element, our capacity for empathy, our ability to make difficult decisions, and our commitment to the common good remains central to any effective response. In this way, the legacy of the Black Death is not confined to history books, but lives on in every act of prevention, every scientific breakthrough, and every community effort to care for the vulnerable. The interconnected world of today, with its rapid movement of people and goods, faces new and evolving threats. Emerging diseases, climate change, and global inequality all contribute to the risk landscape. Yet the principles learned from the plague era remain applicable. Surveillance, rapid response, clear communication, and international solidarity form the core of any successful health strategy. The Black Death taught the painful lesson that ignoring early warnings and failing to act decisively can lead to catastrophe. This wisdom must be heeded as humanity navigates an increasingly complex future. In schools and universities, the story of the plague is often taught not only for its historical significance, but also for its relevance to contemporary issues. It offers a lens through which to examine ethical dilemmas, the role of science in society, and the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility. These discussions help cultivate a generation of thinkers and leaders who are better equipped to handle future crises. The past, far from being irrelevant, becomes a guide, a source of insight, humility, and inspiration. The resilience shown in the aftermath of the Black Death is echoed in modern responses to crisis. Just as medieval societies found ways to recover, adapt, and grow, so too have contemporary communities demonstrated strength in the face of adversity. Healthcare workers, researchers, policymakers, and everyday citizens have all played roles in navigating recent pandemics. Acts of kindness, solidarity, and innovation continue to shape the path forward. These human qualities, tested by history and reaffirmed in the present, form the foundation of hope. As we reflect on the long arc of human experience with disease, the continuity becomes clear. Though the context and tools have changed, the core challenges remain. Balancing fear with reason, individual needs with public good, and short-term actions with long-term consequences are questions that span centuries. The Black Death, with all its horror and loss, offers a map of both pitfalls and possibilities. It reminds us that in times of darkness, the choices we make, how we treat one another, how we invest in knowledge, how we prepare for what may come, can determine not just our survival, but the kind of world we leave behind. The legacy of the Black Death is thus both a memory and a mirror. It reflects the vulnerabilities of our shared humanity and the strengths that enable recovery. It speaks to the impermanence of life and the enduring power of community. In every pandemic since, its influence can be traced in the urgency of scientific inquiry, in the architecture of hospitals, in the protocols of quarantine and vaccination. Even in art, where themes of loss and resilience continue to appear, the shadow of the plague lingers. It is a presence that reminds us to be vigilant, to be wise, and above all, to be compassionate. The most important lesson from that distant past may be the simplest. Disease is a part of the human story, but so too is the response. Through courage, cooperation, and learning, each generation has the power to write its chapter, not defined by fear, but by the determination to endure and to thrive. The Black Death, a cataclysmic event that ravaged Europe in the 14th century, did far more than decimate populations. It etched an enduring shadow into the very landscape, psyche, and cultural fabric of the continent. Its aftermath continues to influence the ways in which societies perceive disease, mortality, and resilience. Even as centuries have passed, the imprint of this historical pandemic remains alive in the form of architectural changes, demographic shifts, legal transformations, and deep-rooted psychological scars. Modern science, art, and public health systems still grapple with its legacy, and the plague continues to serve as a stark reminder of humanity's persistent vulnerability to pandemics and the necessity of vigilance, understanding, and international cooperation. Across Europe, the Black Death did not simply bring about a momentary disruption. It created a rupture in the continuum of history. Villages disappeared entirely, left abandoned as surviving inhabitants either died or fled, and the outlines of once thriving communities were gradually consumed by nature. These ghost villages are still occasionally discovered, marked by subtle depressions in the earth or faint stone outlines, and they stand as mute testaments to the enormity of the demographic toll. Cities were also transformed, not only in population but in their spatial organization. Cemeteries expanded rapidly, often with mass graves hastily constructed in the outskirts of towns. The layout of cities changed over time in response to fears of contagion, with greater attention eventually paid to cleanliness, airflow, and waste disposal, early steps in the long evolution of urban public health. Culturally, the Black Death fostered a profound shift in how people understood life, death, and their place in the cosmos. The omnipresence of death influenced art in lasting ways. Paintings, murals, and manuscripts began to reflect an obsession with mortality, with images of skeletal figures, dancing corpses, and the Grim Reaper becoming increasingly common. This new iconography reflected not only fear, but an attempt to process the trauma, to find meaning in suffering, and to reconcile religious belief with the apparent randomness of death. Literature, too, changed in tone. Writers like Boccaccio and Chaucer portrayed the moral and social upheaval of their times, capturing both the resilience and the absurdities of human behavior under duress. These works remain vital not only for their literary value, but as windows into the lived experience of catastrophe. In religion, the plague caused rifts and transformations. While many clung more tightly to faith, attending processions and engaging in acts of penance, others became disillusioned with the church, which often failed to provide solace or explanations. Priests and monks died in large numbers, creating a clerical vacuum and reducing the authority of the religious establishment. The rise of flagellant movements, increased persecution of minority groups, and alternative spiritual expressions indicated that the spiritual equilibrium of Europe had been fundamentally shaken. Over time, this erosion of unquestioned religious authority may have helped lay the groundwork for later movements, including the Reformation. The socio-economic effects of the Black Death also cast a long shadow. Labor shortages forced landowners to offer better terms to workers, gradually undermining the rigid feudal system. Serfs and peasants, newly empowered by their scarcity, began to move more freely, seek higher wages, and even own land. Laws were enacted to resist these changes, such as statutes attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but in the long term, the shifts were irreversible. Europe began to transition toward a more flexible and dynamic economic structure. This reorganization, born of tragedy, would become a cornerstone for the development of early capitalism and the modern economic landscape. In the legal and governmental realms, the plague highlighted the need for better governance and more effective administration. Local councils took on new responsibilities related to public health, including managing quarantines, cleaning streets, and disposing of bodies. These rudimentary efforts would eventually evolve into municipal health boards and national health systems. The state, in various forms, became more involved in the lives of citizens, especially in times of crisis, a development that would continue through to the modern era. Beyond Europe, the impact of the Black Death stretched across continents, shaping global trade, migration patterns, and even scientific inquiry. The realization that disease could travel along with goods and people created a lasting awareness of global interconnectedness. Maritime quarantines, health passports, and other early public health measures were introduced in port cities, precursors to today's international health regulations. The spread of the plague demonstrated the importance of cross-border cooperation, even if such efforts were rudimentary at the time. In the realm of scientific research, the Black Death remains a topic of intense study. Modern epidemiologists, microbiologists, and geneticists have examined the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the pathogen responsible for the plague, to understand its behavior, mutations, and modes of transmission. Advances in DNA sequencing have allowed researchers to extract and study plague DNA from centuries-old human remains. These studies have helped clarify not only the nature of the medieval pandemics, but also the evolutionary history of infectious diseases. There is ongoing debate about whether different strains were responsible for different waves of the plague, how the pathogen evolved, and how environmental conditions influenced its spread. The examination of historical pandemics like the Black Death also informs present-day models of disease transmission. By studying patterns of movement, mortality rates, and social responses, scientists and policymakers gain valuable insights into how pandemics develop and how they might be mitigated. The past thus becomes a laboratory for the future. The responses to the Black Death, both successful and failed, offer vital case studies for understanding human behavior in the face of mass mortality, which is essential for crafting effective strategies in contemporary and future pandemics. Perhaps most importantly, the Black Death serves as a stark reminder of human vulnerability. In an age when medicine and science were in their infancy, society was brought to its knees by an invisible and misunderstood enemy. Even today, despite advanced knowledge, pandemics can still bring nations to a standstill. The emergence of novel viruses, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and zoonotic diseases demonstrates that humanity is still at the mercy of nature's unpredictability. The shadow of the plague looms over each new health threat, reminding us of what can happen when preparedness falters. Preparedness is one of the central lessons drawn from the plague's legacy. The Black Death revealed that early detection, swift action, and clear communication are essential to limiting the spread of disease. It also emphasized the importance of investing in health infrastructure, not just in times of crisis, but as a permanent societal priority. Modern systems, public health agencies, international health organizations, research institutions, all trace their philosophical roots to the idea that disease must be addressed not just reactively but proactively. The world cannot wait for the next outbreak. It must prepare for it constantly. Global cooperation, too, finds its origins in the lessons of the plague. Disease does not recognize borders, social classes, or political ideologies. The realization that one community's outbreak can become a regional or even global threat has encouraged greater collaboration between nations. Shared databases, vaccine distribution agreements, coordinated responses, and surveillance systems are all part of the modern arsenal developed in response to the understanding that pandemics are a global concern. The Black Death, though a regional disaster in its initial manifestation, ultimately demonstrated the global nature of health threats. Culturally, the fear and awe inspired by the plague continue to influence creative expression. Literature, cinema, theater, and visual arts have revisited the theme of plague time and again. From historical novels that recreate the despair and resilience of plague-stricken cities to dystopian films that imagine modern societies collapsing under new diseases, the emotional resonance of the Black Death remains powerful. It speaks to a universal human fear, the fear of an invisible force that disrupts the natural order, challenges our sense of control, and reminds us of our mortality. At the same time, the memory of the Black Death also serves as a symbol of recovery and adaptation. Despite the devastation, societies did rebuild. New forms of governance, economies, art, and thought emerged from the wreckage. In this way, the plague became a crucible of change. Its long shadow, while dark, also cast light on the enduring human capacity for reinvention. This dual nature, tragedy and transformation, makes the Black Death not just a historical event, but a continuing reference point in the story of human development. Education about the plague plays a crucial role in preserving its lessons. History classes, scientific studies, and public health training often include case studies of the Black Death as a means to foster awareness and critical thinking. The comparisons drawn between the responses of the past and those of the present create a continuum of learning. Understanding what went wrong in the 14th century can inform what must go right in the 21st. The shadow of the Black Death is not a relic. It is a living reminder of the stakes involved in public health decisions. Even in personal terms, the story of the Black Death prompts reflection on human behavior in crisis. How do communities respond to suffering? What motivates compassion or cruelty, solidarity or selfishness? The plague revealed both the best and worst of human nature. From doctors and nurses who risked their lives to care for the sick, to opportunists who profited from death, the spectrum of responses laid bare the complexity of the human condition. These themes are revisited in every modern crisis, showing the timelessness of the moral and ethical questions raised. The enduring shadow of the Black Death is not just about the physical traces left behind or the scientific inquiries it inspired. It is about a deeper understanding of what it means to live in a world where uncertainty is constant and control is often an illusion. It challenges assumptions of progress, reminding humanity that despite all technological advancements, the basic conditions of vulnerability remain. Yet it also affirms the possibility of resilience, that knowledge, cooperation, and compassion can form a bulwark against despair. As new diseases emerge and old ones resurge, the memory of the plague urges vigilance. It calls for humility in the face of nature's power and for unity in confronting common threats. It teaches that preparedness is not merely a logistical task but a moral imperative, one that honors the lessons of those who lived and died in times when hope seemed almost lost. The Black Death, in its devastation, became one of history's most powerful teachers. Its shadow, though cast long ago, continues to shape the present and will influence the future as long as humanity faces the ever-present possibility of epidemic disease. In reflecting on the vast and lasting imprint of the Black Death, it becomes clear that this catastrophe was not just a historical event confined to the distant past, but a pivotal moment that reshaped the course of human civilization. It transformed landscapes, societies, economies, belief systems, and ways of thinking. The trauma it inflicted echoed through generations, altering how people approached life, death, and the unknown forces of nature. But from that devastation also emerged resilience, innovation, and a deeper awareness of the need for collective action in the face of shared threats. The plague taught that suffering can serve as both a warning and a catalyst. It revealed the consequences of ignorance and inaction, while also showing the strength of human adaptability and the potential for change in the aftermath of crisis. The enduring shadow of the Black Death remains not to haunt, but to illuminate, to remind each generation of the importance of readiness, empathy, scientific inquiry, and unity in the face of adversity. As the world continues to encounter new challenges, from pandemics to climate disruptions, the legacy of the Black Death endures as both a cautionary tale and a source of hard-earned wisdom. Remembering it is not an act of fear, but one of responsibility, to honor the past by shaping a more informed and resilient future.